continue. O heavenly King, comforter the Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and fillest all things, treasury of good things and giver of life, come and dwell in us and cleanse us of all impurity and save our souls, O good one. Today, as we continue our reading, I hope we will be both edified and comforted by the Holy Fathers who provide us with a tremendous inheritance, a tremendous treasury of wisdom and consolation that they have left us in their sayings. So we finished reading about Abba Joseph of Panephysis last week, and today we're going to read a number of the fathers because there are quite a few here who have just a handful of chapters. Next is Abba James, chapter 1. Abba James said, "It is better to receive hospitality than to offer it." That's quite interesting. It is better to receive hospitality than to offer it. Well, it would seem here, maybe for sort of the those who don't know the culture of the fathers living in the desert, that he's contradicting to the Holy Apostle Paul. And, in saying that, because St. Paul says it is better to give than it is to receive. But here he's talking about hospitality. And hospitality has to do with, obviously, conversation and communication and sort of human interaction. And so in that sense, what he is saying is that it is better for you to be in need of hospitality than to offer it yourself, because when you're offering hospitality, you are creating an atmosphere in which, potential idle talk or condemnation of someone might transpire in a conversation. So from that perspective, perhaps he is saying it is better to receive hospitality than to give it, because as the one who is giving it, well, you're then responsible for sort of the possibility of someone sinning in one way or another. Chapter 2. He warned everyone who receives praise to think of his sins and to realize that he does not deserve what has been said of him. So, if he says he warned everyone, or perhaps then we could understand that he instructed everyone when we receive praise to think of our sins and to realize that we do not deserve that which was said of us. And I think that those of us who are conscientious of making spiritual progress, in our spiritual life, we realize very often, yes, that whenever we're given compliments, we don't deserve them. When people tell us that we're kind or we're generous, or that we know that we could be more kind, more generous. And definitely, most often, no one but God and our confessor knows about our sins. And so people might be inclined to compliment us, thinking that we are good, when in fact we know very good and well that while striving to be good, while making every possible attempt, hopefully, to be good, we still fall short quite a lot. And there's plenty for us to work on. Chapter 3. He also said, just as a lamp lights up a dark room, so the fear of God, when it penetrates the heart of a man, illuminates him, teaching him all the virtues and commandments of God. Now, this is truly quite beautiful, and considering the fact that there are 3 stages of the fear of God, according to the fathers, when they talk about a slave's fear, then a hired man's fear, and then a son's fear. A slave is afraid of the punishment. A hired man is afraid to lose his wages. But the son is afraid to upset his father and to cause him grief. So in that sense, this particular saying of Abba James is relevant in all the stages of a Christian's life. Whether you're a beginner and you have a very sort of a primitive fear of God, you're afraid of being, cast into the fiery Gehenna, and you think, oh no, what have I done or what have I said? How can possibly reflect back on me or on my family? Whether you are somewhat advanced and you think, well, if I've done something, I won't gain something. So, there's that sort of a hired man's fear. Or whether you are, and of course, there are very few of us who approach that stage of fear when we see God as our Father and we're afraid to upset him because we love him. And that is exactly what St. Anthony meant when he said, I no longer fear God, I love him. But the person that you love, you don't want to upset that person. You don't want to hurt that person. You don't want to disappoint that person. So in that sense, your fear is somewhat different. You're not afraid of the person. You're afraid of damaging your relationship with that person. And that healthy fear, that healthy concern definitely illumines your soul and will guide you in all virtue. That's very, very true. Chapter 4, he also said, we do not need words only, for at the present time there are many words among men, but we need works, for this is what is required, not words which do not bear fruit. Well, yes, it's one thing to talk about humility, and it's quite another thing to be humble. It's one thing to talk about prayer, and it's another thing to pray. It's one thing to talk about piety, and it's quite another to be pious. And I think that in this case, it's quite interesting that he is Abba James, so, possibly Jacob, I guess, Yaakov in Greek, and Yaakov in Russian. James is a sort of an odd translation of the name. But he's definitely here sort of correlating and perhaps, echoing the words of St. James the Apostle, who in his epistle said, you have faith and I have works. Show me your faith, and I will show you my faith by my works. And so one person can talk about believing in God and live a godless life, and another person can say nothing. But by abstaining from sin, that person will preach louder than any possible words. So in that sense, yes, indeed, it's a beautiful saying. Abba Hierox, chapter 1. A brother questioned Abba Hierox, saying, give me a word, how can I be saved? The old man said to him, sit in your cell, and if you are hungry, eat. If you are thirsty, drink. Only do not speak evil of anyone, and you will be saved. Now, this gives a really good idea of understanding how the Holy Fathers, the desert dwellers, perceived salvation. They fasted a lot, so they wouldn't eat, they wouldn't drink. They were very strict in their asceticism. But you see that here he says, if you're hungry, eat, and if you're thirsty, eat. Only do not speak evil of anyone, and you will be saved. So he is saying that calumny, that other sins not committed with the flesh, sometimes are far greater, far more damaging. In other words, if you are hungry, eat. So don't fast, strictly, but don't judge anyone. And if that's the case, then you will be saved. There's a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful story somewhere in the Patericon, I think, that talks about a monk who was quite sort of slothful and very lax in his, sort of ascetic struggles. smiling on his deathbed. And the other monks in the monastery said, Abba, why are you smiling? How can you be smiling? Why aren't you terrified? You're giving your soul into God's hands. You're about to die, but you never really struggled. And he said, I have hope, brothers, because I did not judge anyone. And as he died with a smile on his face, it was revealed to either the abbot of that monastery or to one of the God-bearing elders that the angels asked him and said, why should we take you to the kingdom of heaven? Did you fast? And he said, no, not much. Did you pray? No, not much. Did you, give charity? No, not much. So then why should we take you? And he said, I never judged anyone. And straight away they took him all the way to the kingdom of heaven. So that is a beautiful thing to think about, the fact that it isn't by fasting, it isn't by praying that we are saved in the extent, but by not judging anyone, we can achieve tremendous good as well. And so I recall the words of the Lord who says, the Pharisees teach you to tithe and sort of mint and cumin and so on, but they neglect the weightier, the heavier matters of the law. These things you should do, like the heaviers, and the others you should not neglect as well. And so, should we fast? Should we persevere when we're thirsty and hungry? Yes, of course we should. And that has its place, and it's a tremendous instrument in spiritual struggle as well. But even more importantly, we should not judge anyone, especially those who maybe by outward appearance or by some reason are not doing as well as we are, because we might be grievously disappointed at the end of our lives, standing before God to see that they have actually succeeded ahead of us, while we all the time thought that they were falling behind. He also said, this is chapter 2 of Abba Hierarchs, I have never uttered or wished to hear a worldly remark. Well, that's really quite interesting as well. So basically he's speaking here about the fact that he has all of his ascetic life, all of his conscious life as a monastic, he's avoided idle talk. And that's very, very instructive. John the eunuch, chapter 1. In his youth, Abba John the eunuch questioned an old man, how have you been able to carry out the work of God in peace? For we cannot do it, not even with labor. The old man said, we were able to do it because we considered the work of God to be primary and bodily needs to be subsidiary. But you hold bodily necessities to be primary and the work of God to be secondary. That is why you labor, and that is why that is why you labor, and that is why the Savior said to the disciples, seek first kingdom and his righteousness, and all these things shall be yours as well. Now, that's quite interesting. So basically he's saying, how are you able to do God's work in peace? He says, because we put God's work first, and our sort of bodily needs and everything else secondary. You are struggling, you're having a very difficult time because you put your bodily needs first, and you put the kingdom of heaven second. So therefore, struggling for the kingdom of heaven, yes, obviously, you're having a difficult time. Now, how can we relate this to modern day life? If you find yourself listening to the sermon spoken by the priest in church and thinking, oh, I'm hungry, how long is this going to continue? Or, I need to do thus and so, I need to pay my taxes, or I need to do this bill, or I'm meeting somebody for coffee. Why is he talking for so long? Well, obviously, you're putting your bodily and worldly needs first, and the acquisition of the kingdom of heaven second. However, if you're present at the service and the service continues for a bit longer, if you're not upset, well, that means that you focus on the service first and then on your bodily needs second. And sometimes, believe it or not, even for those of us who have attended church for a long time, sometimes it's a serious temptation, because when we are in church and we're accustomed to leaving at a particular time, if the choir makes us late, sometimes we grumble and we judge, and very much to our own shame. That's not to say that people in church should take the liberty and extend the service just to try us and to push us. That wouldn't be useful, because that might actually put us in a position where we would be grumbling against the services of the church, which is not a position any one of us wants to be in. However, when it happens, by accident, it can sometimes really show us where our priorities lie, whether we want our rest first or we want to pray first. Chapter 2 of John the Eunuch. Abba John said, "Our father, Abba Anthony, said he had never put his own personal advantage before the good of a brother." Now, this is sometimes sort of a difficult saying, because basically what it means is that you should put others first, always. However, if you consider the setting in which St. Anthony lived, all the other monks strove to do the same. They were also trying to put another first. We live in a society where people are not even aware of other people's needs sometimes, because their own needs sort of trump everything, and they fall into the temptation, perhaps sometimes, of abusing others' consideration, others' hospitality, others' kindness, others' patience. And if we were to put them first once, we are sure to see them expecting to be put first, twice, thrice, and sort of the more you do it, the more they expect it. That would not be for their benefit, neither would it be for our benefit. Discerningly, we should approach the needs of our brother, and indeed, we should not be guided by our own selfish desires and selfish expectations. We should try to put our brother first. But putting our brother first, we should put the brother's true needs first. And the true need for any brother is the salvation of his soul or of a sister's soul. So in that sense, if we find ourselves indulging, if we find ourselves enabling someone to take advantage of us, to abuse our love and kindness and patience, then it would no longer fall into what is said here. See, he put his personal advantage, never put his personal advantage before the good of a brother. So he put the brother's salvation first. Sometimes putting the brother's salvation first will actually lead us, not to say that we would actually act selfishly. No, God forbid, never. But we should be aware of the brother's true needs, or of the sister's true needs, and we should not indulge. We should do that which is expedient for salvation, seemingly as the doctor at times, knowing that a bitter medicine is required for the patient's recovery, will administer it, sometimes with a certain degree of clever strategy. In this case, I really like sort of quoting Mary Poppins, even though she's certainly not one of the fathers, but she presents a very sort of useful pastoral strategy for a spoonful of sugar helps the medicine go down. At least in the old Mary Poppins movie, that was the line in her song. And so sometimes we even see St. Paul doing that, because in his epistles, he starts out by praising, by thanking God for the people to whom he's writing, and praising them, for being steadfast in the faith, for making efforts, for doing good things, and only then proceeding to sort of criticize, to point out their shortcomings. So in that sense, you would say that he definitely added honey to the bitter medicine. Sometimes we have to do that. But actually, by doing that, we are, in fact, following this advice of St. John the Eunuch and, of course, St. Anthony the Great, by putting our brother first. that which is expedient for our brother's salvation. Sometimes putting the brother's salvation or the sister's salvation first will require us to have an uncomfortable conversation, or maybe to touch upon a subject that is somewhat explosive. We should never do it feeling ourselves righteous and justified, and sort of exalting ourselves over our brother. We should never do that. In all kindness, in all humility, we need to do that which is best for our brother. And sometimes, indeed, it's not an indulgence. It's the necessity to say or to do that which will lead to the brother's salvation. Sometimes the brother will not like us for it, but it still has to be done. And for that, we need courage and determination, wisdom, meekness, and humility, and love, of course, above all. Chapter 3. Abba John the Sicilian, igumen of Rathu, said to the brethren, "My sons, in the same way that we have fled from the world, let us equally flee from the desires of the flesh." Now, this is truly beautiful. So in this case, Abba John the Sicilian, and I'm not sure if he's the same as Abba John the eunuch, igumen of Rathu. Rathu, that's the monastery, a monastic community. Isn't it beautiful? He says, in the same way as we fled the world, we should flee from the desires of the flesh. In fact, sometimes when the fathers talk about fleeing the world, they're not talking about, the created world as such. But by world, they, and I think that somewhere in the patristic literature, there is this understanding that by world, by the word cosmos, in Greek, the word cosmos, by the word world, sorry, it's almost a tongue twister, the Holy Fathers meant sort of the summary of all the passions. So you are not a true Christian, and every Christian is required to renounce the world. We follow Christ. We're not monastics. We have not necessarily taken the monastic vows. We're not living in a monastery. Neither are we desert dwellers. But if we are Christians, we're not supposed to love the world. So we're not supposed to love the passions. We're supposed to love the Lord. And so, especially for the monastics, if they have made the effort of leaving the world behind, so coming to a monastery, he's saying, well, let us also leave the desires of the flesh behind as well. Because what benefit would it do for a monastic to sit in a cell and to sort of ruminate all the lusts and pleasures of the world? So even though bodily that monastic is undefiled, but spiritually there's a tremendous amount of defilement. And so in that sense, I think somewhere the Fathers said, you could live in the middle of the world and be in complete solitude, and you can live in solitude and bring the entire world with you in your mind and your heart. So this is a beautiful, beautiful advice of this Abba John. Chapter 4. He also said, let us imitate our fathers. They lived in this place with much austerity and peace. Now, this is quite interesting that he says, with much austerity and peace. So we should not only imitate sort of the bodily struggles of the saints who came before us. We should not only try to, fast very strictly, maybe make so many prostrations or sort of, do other undertakings, but we should also imitate their peace. And of course, recently with the Russian youth reading the commentary of the Divine Liturgy by Saint Nicholas Kabasilas, we read about the fact that sort of the very first prayer of the liturgy after the exclamation of the priest, blessed is the kingdom, is in peace let us pray to the Lord. And Saint Nicholas Kabasilas says that without peace we can't pray. If we're agitated, if we're angry, if we are sort of, mulling over some wrongs that were done against us, we can't pray. Our prayer won't be heard. We have to be at peace. And so this is beautiful. He says, let us imitate our fathers. They lived in this place with much austerity and peace. So let us live in peace with one another. That's what we must practice at all costs. And I really appreciate the fact that in his lectures in Russian, Alexey Ilyich Osipov, the teacher of the dogmatic theology and many other sort of the apologetics and other courses at the Moscow Spiritual Academy, he says quite a lot. Where there is peace, there is God. Where there is no peace, there is no God. So we must try to imitate not only the active sort of physical virtues of the saints, but we must also imitate the peace that they had. Even with those who abused them, who offended them, who persecuted them, they were at peace. They weren't aggravated. They weren't sort of wound up. And we must definitely seek to have this peace. Chapter 5, he also said, "My sons, let us not make this place dirty, since our fathers cleansed it from the demons." So this is quite beautiful. Here, by saying, let us not make this place dirty, he is not speaking of the physical dirt, of the dust and the various sort of trash and elements of our human life, the worldly life, or, sort of the life in the flesh. But he's saying that the fathers who came before us cleansed this place, cleansed this monastery of the demons. They drove them away. And how do we sort of bring the demons back? By engaging in the life of passion. So if we envy, if we grumble, if we judge, if we revile someone, if we are jealous, if we are competitive with each other in an unhealthy way, the demons come back because we are doing their works, and they feel comfortable in our presence when we are sort of engaged in these works of passion. It is by leaving the desires of the flesh behind that his monks would actually continue to keep that place clean. And that is very, very, very important. Sometimes we find that we could live in a very nice and spacious home. We could keep it clean and we could still find no peace in it. And it is because there's no peace within our hearts. And first and foremost, we must keep peace with God. And peace with God is devastated, is undermined, is sort of destroyed the moment that we engage in sin willingly. So keeping ourselves pure from the desires of the flesh, from condemnation, from envy, from both bodily and spiritual passions, we could keep the peace with God and we could keep our lives clean. Because in baptism, the demons were driven away. God has given us a clean life, and it is up to us to keep it pure. Chapter 6, he said, this is a place for asceticism, not for worldly business. So if you've come here, this is, his monastery is a place for spiritual struggle, not to, make money. This is not a place to engage in worldly affairs. And I would say that the same should really apply even to parish churches. The first and foremost purpose of a parish is to provide sort of the place and the means of salvation for its flock. And so if people come to church seeking first and foremost not the salvation of their souls, but some gain, be it for their business or for someone else's, well, then we come to church for the wrong reasons. So not even monastics, but even just regular Christians. Abba John of the Cells, chapter 1. Abba John of the Cells told us this story. There was in Egypt a very rich and beautiful courtesan, to whom noble and powerful people came. Now one day she happened to be near the church, and she wanted to go in. The subdeacon, who was standing at the doors, would not allow her to enter, saying, "You are not worthy to enter the house of God, for you are impure." The bishop heard the noise of their argument and came out. Then the courtesan said to him, "He will not let me enter the church." So the bishop said to her, "You are not allowed to enter it, for you are not pure. She was filled with compunction and said to him, henceforth I will not commit fornication any more. The bishop said to her, if you bring your wealth here, I shall know that you will not commit fornication any more. She brought her wealth, and the bishop burned it all in the fire. Then she went into the church, weeping and saying, if this has happened to me below, what would I not have suffered above? So she was converted and became a vessel of election. So the vessel of election, meaning she was elect, meaning she was chosen, she became the vessel of the chosen, sort of she became like other Christians who live a pure life. But what a powerful parallel here that she afforded the church. The bishop, who did not seek her material possessions for his own gain, who was obviously a true shepherd of his flock, burned all of her possessions that she acquired through sin. And she's saying, if I suffered this here, what would I have suffered in the world to come, in the life to come? Indeed, a very powerful story. John of the Thebaid, chapter 1 and only chapter. Abba John of the Thebaid said, first of all, the monk must gain humility, for it is the first commandment of the Lord, who said, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. So this Abba obviously equated humility and the poor, sort of being poor in spirit. Of course, there's very little to comment on sort of a saying like this, because I think that monasticism and humility sort of go hand in hand. It's an oxymoron, it's a paradox, or you might say in colloquial speech, it's a joke to see a proud monk or nun. Isadora the priest, chapter 1. It was said of Abba Isadora the priest that one day a brother came to invite him to a meal, but the old man refused to go, saying, Adam was deceived by food and had to live outside paradise. The brother said to him, are you afraid to leave your cell? The other responded, my child, I am afraid because the devil, like a roaring lion, seeketh whom he may devour. He often said, when someone gives himself a drink, he will not escape being attacked by thoughts. Lot, indeed, being constrained by his daughters, got drunk with wine, and through the effect of drunkenness, the devil easily brought him to a shameful act of fornication. So here what we see exhibited by Abba Isadora the priest is a healthy fear of God, which is manifested in the fear of failing, in the fear of falling. And when the brother who invited him to a meal said, are you afraid to leave your cell? And he said, I'm afraid because the devil, like a roaring lion, seeketh whom he may devour. Meaning that, yes, of course, I am afraid because my adversary is great. And so in that sense, staying in your cell and being prudent is wise. It's never wise to be bold and daring and to think somehow that you are spiritually wise enough and good enough to withstand an assault of the enemy. We see this often exhibited in the monastic life, where, for example, even St. John of the Ladder, the writer of the book, The Ladder of Divine Ascent, essentially says that he was constrained to write the book. He didn't set out to do it on his own, because everyone living in those days was considering the fact that whenever they would want to do something of their own accord, not out of obedience, they would be exposed to a potential temptation that they might not be able to resist. And so they were very cautious not to take boldness, to test the devil. I am sure that they were greatly rewarded for their humility, because to say that I'm afraid to sin, that's why I'm not leaving, takes humility. And as we know, of course, that God resists the proud, but he gives grace to the humble. Chapter 2. Abba Isidore said, if you truly desire the kingdom of heaven, despise riches and respond to divine favors. and respond to divine favors. Well, I'm not exactly sure what sort of the word would be original, in the original language. Maybe this is not the best translation. But then, of course, if you despise riches, and respond to divine favors, well, maybe, yes, basically, rather than acquiring worldly riches, acquire the heavenly ones, acquire the heavenly favors. And so think of it this way. Sometimes when we are willing to give up our earthly riches, we can use them to buy ourselves divine favors. Meaning, if we use our riches wisely, if we give them to the poor, if we feed the poor with our riches, well, then we will definitely have a divine favor. You might say that God would owe us, right? That which we gave to the poor would be returned to us by God in the life to come. And I think that's what he means. Chapter 3, he also said, it is impossible for you to live according to God if you love pleasures and money. Well, that really doesn't need much of a commentary, because if you are loving pleasures and money, you will find yourself having an extremely difficult time living a pious life, because pleasures and money require sacrifices. Similarly, as a spiritual life according to the gospel requires sacrifices. But the sacrifices that people do for pleasures and money are often of a negative nature. So doing things that are right does not guarantee you, pleasures and money. So very likely, if you love pleasures and money, you will end up doing things that you would not even consider yourself doing right now. But once you set off to gain pleasure and money, you will find yourself sort of necessity doing things which, before you started on that path, you would have condemned yourself as well. And of course, that can mean lying, betrayal, stealing, appropriating things that are not your own, and many, many, many other terrible things. Sometimes people even murder and steal, because they want more money and more pleasures. Chapter 4, he also said, if you fast regularly, do not be inflated with pride, but if you think highly of yourself because of it, then you had better eat meat. It is better for a man to eat meat than to be inflated with pride and glorify himself. And so this actually is a very interesting idea that we see sort of as a scarlet thread throughout the writings of all the fathers. They basically say that it's better to eat meat than to be proud of one's fasting. There's another account where at a monastic gathering, sort of in a common trapeza, the common meal in a common, meal hall or, dinner hall, someone was serving boiled vegetables, and a disciple of an elder said, sort of refused and said, my elder only eats, water and bread. He doesn't eat boiled vegetables. And in response to that, an old monk, like a sort of a seasoned monastic, a true elder, stood up, looked at his elder in the face and said, it would be better for you to eat meat in your cell than for something like this to be said about you publicly. In other words, it is better sort of to eat meat, which of course, is considered a no-no for the monastics, right? They do not eat meat. That's part of their monastic vows and so on. But it's better to sort of violate your monastic vow to eat meat, to be, than to be so proud. And this is something that Isadora the priest is saying as well. Overall, I think it is always better to think of yourself as a sinner than to think of yourself as pious. And in some cases, our efforts to keep the fast or to do certain other things can lead to a pharisaical pride and this idea that we're somehow better than others. Well, yes, I'll stop there for now. So chapter 5, he also said, this is Isadora the priest, disciples must love their as their fathers. Disciples must love as their fathers those who are truly their masters and fear them as their leaders. They should not lose their fear because of love, nor because of fear should love be obscured. So what he's saying is it's actually quite interesting. Disciples must love as their fathers those who are truly their masters and fear them as their leaders. They should not lose their fear because of love, nor because of fear should love be obscured. So in other words, what he's saying is the disciples should love their fathers as their masters. Sort of, realize that they are not just fathers, in sort of a loving and gentle and kind way, whose instructions then can be disregarded because of love. He's saying that love should not do away with fear. The disciples should fear their teachers. They should fear their masters and their fathers as those who instruct them and who lead them on the way to salvation. But because of this fear, their love of them as their fathers should not be harmed as well. So essentially he's saying with discernment, there has to be a healthy relationship between the disciple and his elder. The disciple should love the elder as a father, but remember also that the elder is like a master, meaning that whatever he says has to be obeyed and fulfilled. And neither one should harm the other. Love should not make the disciple slack, thinking, well, the elder loves me, he will let it go, he will forgive, he will not be upset if I don't do something or whatever. Neither should fear hamper love. Just because the disciple fears the master doesn't mean that he should not love him anymore. So there shouldn't be this sort of a slave's fear, the way the slaves just sort of afraid of being punished or beaten and so on. The relationship has to be healthy and balanced. Chapter 6, he also said, if you desire salvation, do everything that leads you to it. Well, that's quite succinct and powerful, right? If you are doing something that does not lead you to salvation, why? Why would you do something like that if you desire salvation? So if you want to be saved, do everything that leads you to salvation and don't do the things that would actually sort of not be useful. Someone sent me a wonderful message about peace earlier and said that no God, no peace with an N-O, and then no God, K-N-O-W, no God, no peace. Truly, truly a very clever and a beautiful saying. Chapter 7 of Isadora the priest. It was said of Abba Isadora that when a brother went to see him, he would escape to the furthest corner of his cell. The brethren said to him, Abba, what are you doing? He said, even the wild animals, when they flee to their lairs, are saved. He said this for the edification of the brethren. So what he was saying basically here in this case, even the wild animals, when they are trying to avoid their predators, they flee to their lairs, meaning they hide in their holes. And so the monastic, when someone would come to see him, Abba Isidore would sort of go into the very far corner of his cell. He would keep his distance. He would flee from another person. And by that, of course, he's not trying to disrespect the other person or to be unkind or not to give hospitality to the other person. But here's the thought that I would leave you with today, because we're going to stop sort of with Abba Isidore today. That was his last chapter. Think of it this way. We are saved through our brother, by loving our brother, by serving our brother. And we lose salvation also through our brother. We could tempt each other. We could lead each other into sin by judging and so on. And that is why many of the fathers, and if you recall when we read about Saint Arsenius the Great, how he avoided all human contact, on purpose, with great persistence, he avoided being sort of familiar and frivolous with other men, because temptation comes through other men as well, a great amount of temptation. And that is why the fathers say, love everyone and flee from everyone. And so those of us obviously living in the world, those of us attending regular parishes, those of us who are not monastics, we have to be around other people on a regular basis. But let this particular instruction of the fathers be sort of a stark reminder to us that we must be extremely careful and delicate in our interactions with other people. It is so easy to offend someone by, sort of a careless word, and lead that person to temptation, to sin. We might not even see how our actions led that other person to sin, but we would have to give an answer for that before God. And for that matter, that is why the fathers strove to such an extent to avoid all unnecessary contact. They would not speak to strangers readily and easily. They would sort of mind their own business, knowing very well that for every idle word that we speak, we have to give an account. And of course, the moment we are around other people, our idle words multiply tremendously. So with this in mind, let us remember that sometimes the best thing to do is really to go home, to stay home. And often after church, sometimes, sort of even as a priest hearing confessions of other people, the greatest temptation, sort of the loss of grace after receiving of the Holy Communion, happens specifically because we stay around, we chat, we talk, we end up judging other people, we end up talking about things that are sort of inconsequential on our path to salvation. And in some ways, it would be much better if we received Holy Communion, finished the liturgy, prayed, and then just went home and prayed at home and read and rested. But that would be better. That's not necessarily, something that we need to do every single time we attend church, but that is definitely something to keep in mind for the future. At any rate, God willing, next week we will continue with this wonderful book. I believe next week it might be better to do it on a Wednesday as well, so that we don't have too much of an interval between our readings. Please pray for me, a sinner, and God bless all of you. Have a wonderful night.